Hi, so sorry I'm not there in the room with y'all today. Or at least, not all of me. My name, or the labeling that refers to this, is Lux Miranda. My pronouns are she, they. I'm a PhD student at Uppsala University in Sweden. And I hope that by the end of this, you'll be thinking a lot more about where the boundaries of me end, and how much of me can truly be right there in the room with you, and about how thinking about identity in this way can inform the ways in which we conceptualize artificial identity as it is in robots, digital assistants, and other artificial agents. We might, along the way, even come up with one or two answers to the question, who is a robot? And can we think more clearly about the question with a more foundational philosophical understanding of identity, particularly as it pertains to artificial identity? Throughout the HRI literature, when scholars have referred to identity, they may have meant a myriad of different things. And we can sort of intuitively identify that all of these facets are some sort of identity, whether we're talking about selfhood or the mind or one's body or consciousness. We can even talk about social identities like group belonging. And these are all very different things, but we sort of have an idea of them being aspects of the same thing. So how can we reconcile these things? And how can we talk about them in the realm of robots or other agents exhibiting some of these traits themselves? And we can do this through a new philosophical basis for understanding and thinking about artificial identity. One that is a synthesis of contemporary scientific perspectives from fields as diverse as astrobiology, cognitive science, and modern feminist theory, combined with Buddhist philosophy on the nature of human identity, extended to also think about and include artificial identity. And through this, we can construct a model that is useful for analyzing systems of identity and designing new ones. The premise of the model can be considered in 5 parts. Firstly, that artificial identity and human identity can be modeled in fundamentally the same way, and that differences between the two are noteworthy exceptions rather than fundamental differences. Secondly, boundaries separating different identities are ultimately arbitrary and artificial, but often constitute consequential social and psychological realities. Thirdly, rather than there being some sort of immutable essence as to what something's identity is, identity can be thought of as the sum of 5 aggregates, which are individually distinct but also bleed into each other. Much like how one can distinguish individual piles of sand in the desert, but it is nigh impossible to draw a single clear line separating one dune from the other without making some arbitrary distinctions. Fourthly, the model is temporally composable to account for the way in which identity changes through time. Lastly, the model is spatially composable, accounting for how identity can be thought of in varying levels of abstraction, from the level of group identity to the individual to further subdivisions still. And here are the aggregates themselves. Now, these are based off of the traditional Buddhist conception of selfhood as consisting of these 5 things, the names of which are normally in Sanskrit, and the English translations are left as an exercise to the translator. So here I have chosen some words to more clearly provoke ideas of how this applies to both humans and machines. Firstly, we can talk about form. That's just any sort of physical or virtual manifestation of a body or the environment or anything that is physically made up into an identity. Secondly, we can consider sensory input, which is the raw information from any sort of sense channel. So for humans, that's touch, sight, sound, smell. For machines, that's any sort of sensor data, including camera data, microphone audio, temperature readings, that sort of thing. Down here we have consciousness. Now, human consciousness goes here. The model allows for artificial consciousness, but does not require it. But it may still be useful to model the amount of consciousness that something has as a tool for understanding the amount of ethical treatment that we might need to provide it. While this might not apply to a purely robotic system, it certainly does to cyborgs or biosynthetic chimeric organisms. Here we have assemblage, and this can essentially be thought of whatever sits in the mind, whether that's a human mind or whatever sits on a computer's hard drive or is currently being run on the processor, which includes memories, intentions, algorithms, stored data, etc. Lastly, but perhaps most importantly, we have labeling, which is essentially the imposition of discrete categories, which we give names to, which we label, when in fact we are trying to describe phenomena that is ultimately continuous. And these boundaries which we draw and labels that we make, as I said, are often arbitrary, but are very real in our experience. This includes things like the boundary between self, other, and environment, and especially critically, the social construction of identities such as gender and ethnicity, which we have to pay especially close attention to. Now, when it comes to actually using this model, it's got two purposes. Firstly, to simply allow researchers to better think about artificial identity in the abstract. And secondly, as a concrete modeling tool for understanding existing systems and designing new ones. Now, when it comes to that second task, let me walk you through an example. In the first panel, we have the interactant, not the user, not the biggest fan of that word, talking with a virtual assistant. And then in the second panel, the interactant has changed the gender characteristics of that virtual agent to be more feminine. In the third panel here, the virtual agent has now re-embodied into a physical robot. And lastly, the interactant dons a pair of VR goggles and some other equipment to allow them to embody themselves into the robot and control it as if they were one. Now, the full paper walks through this example for modeling each and every aggregate as it goes through each of these four phases and includes several different perspectives on how you might accomplish this as well and to what end. But, for example, modeling just the form, it's quite straightforward. We have our human's form being simply their body, perhaps their clothing, while the artificial agent's form changes from being virtual to a physical robot. And lastly, in the final panel, we might conceive of them as not two distinct agents, but one, a human robot with its own unique form. Things get a little bit more complex when we start to talk about the labeling. Since all labels are created from some sort of perspective, it's useful to keep track of the perspective of both the human and the robot in this case. So for the first panel, from the human's perspective, some ascriptions that we might consider listing are their conception of themselves as a mind-body woman roboticist, and that this other thing right here is a gender-ambiguous virtual robot. In our second panel, of course, the only changes made in this perspective is that the robot is now feminine. And again, we just sort of update the state to the robot now being a physical robot for our third panel. And lastly, for our fourth panel, the two agents' perspectives merge, and we end up with a human robot conceiving of themselves as a human robot mind program bodies woman cyborg roboticist. I don't know about you, but I'd love to be one of those. So all of this can lead us back to the question of who is a robot? And with this model, we can perhaps come up with two different answers. Firstly, that the question is false. That there is a defined who that we can empirically deduce is there in any sort of identity is a false notion, and that the question itself doesn't make sense. Now, if you're the more practical type and that answer isn't so satisfying to you, the second possible answer, we can model it. Thank you all so much for listening. Once again, I am Lex Miranda from Uppsala University in Sweden, and this was absolutely the tensest thing I've ever written. So if you have any confusions or want to learn more, please check out the paper through this QR code here, and otherwise, I will see you next time, or at least some part of me will.